most popular server library, does anybody know what that is? No? Who's heard of a little library called React? Who's heard of it? A couple of people. Who's actually written code in React? One person. Okay. All right. Now, React, a lot of people would argue, and I can see their point of view, that React is a client-side library. But I feel that React is a server-side library because it requires some tooling that needs the installation of a server. Now, theoretically, you can write React to be client-side only, where you do not need a server. Theoretically, you can. And in fact, just so that you know how to do it, I'm going to show you how you can write React code that runs on the client only. Now, one thing to be aware of React is that when you write React code, you are using JavaScript extensions. And very often you'll see, has anybody seen a file with a .jsx extension? Right? JSX stands for JavaScript extensions. Out of the box, the browser does not know anything about JSX. Doesn't know anything about it. When you write React code, you are writing that code in JSX. And that code then has to be what's called transpiled. Transpiled. That's where the server comes in. And the server that is most often used is called Node. Right? Node.js or Node.js. Those are different ways of defining or referring to Node. And we actually installed Laragon on our virtual machine. And we actually went and updated Node, right? We did the update of Node to the latest version, right? Node works very, very well with React because as a server, you can take your JSX code and transpile it into JavaScript, just plain regular JavaScript. And the browser knows how to handle plain vanilla JavaScript. So you have that server part that sits between the browser and React that will do the transpiling for you. If you are using React from a client-side perspective, you have to provide the way that the server does the transpiling. You have to do that in the browser. And because the browser only knows about vanilla JavaScript, nothing about JSX, you need some additional libraries that will take the JSX that you write and transpile it on the fly in the browser to vanilla JavaScript that can then be executed. So from a client-side perspective, you will have to incorporate some libraries that will do the transpiling on the fly. Because it's doing that transpiling on the fly, there is a performance penalty of running React in the browser. If you do it the way that most people write React code, where you write your React code, and when you're done, you issue a command to Node and you say, hey, Node, build my application. And Node goes off and does all the transpiling, and the end result is a JavaScript file. Only gets transpiled once. Once it's transpiled, you can execute it as many times as possible as needed. So there's no performance penalty that way. But for local React, there is a performance penalty. So what I'm going to do here, let me just see. Okay. I am going to create unit 4, because we're now on unit 4. And the unit 4 index page and just remind myself how we did. Okay. So it was just unit. The unit 4 home page. This is all about server-side libraries. And we'll link it up to our CSS. And let's just pull out a browser window here that we can open this in. Right, so there's unit 4. And I'm going to, in my unit 4, add a nav tag, unordered list, and a list item, and an anchor tag. And the anchor tag is going to go to react-local.html. And we'll just say React local. And that means I need to create the React local page. So we'll give it a title of React local. Link it to our CSS. And if I view this in the browser, you can see that, oh, little bit of a problem with multi-cursors is that you always have to make sure that you are keeping, you don't have them active when you don't want. Otherwise you get extra code like I got. All right. So in order to do a React local, what we have to do is we have to include the React library. And I'm just going to use a CDN for the React library. So you can see this is from Unpackage, and it's using React. This is version 16, and the library is called react.production.min.js. Right, so that's the main React library. Now, React is a library that creates what's called a shadow DOM. A shadow DOM. When you are updating the document object model on the fly, that can be processor or intensive as far as time is concerned. So what React did is it said, oh, you know what? I am going to create a shadow DOM, and when you use React to update, you're going to update that shadow DOM. And when you are ready, you can tell me, oh, go and compare the shadow DOM to the actual document object model that the browser is using to display, and update that DOM. And that's when everything gets updated. So in React, you can, using the shadow DOM, make tons and tons of changes, and then only update the DOM itself once. It's quicker. React is efficiently written to update the shadow DOM very quickly, and then it doesn't affect the DOM that the browser is keeping a track of, but only when you tell it, oh, you need to now take what's in the shadow DOM and update the actual DOM from the shadow DOM. Which means that React has a library for that DOM. So here, I'm going to incorporate the React DOM library, the React DOM library. So those are the two libraries that you need, and there might be more, but for now, we'll just use these two. We'll keep it very simple. And what we're going to do is have these two libraries, and we're going to write some JSX code. However, remember that JSX code needs to be compiled into actual JavaScript. Well, there is a library to do that. It's called the Babel library. And you can see here we are using the Babel standalone library. Typically, when you are using Node to do all the transpiling, Babel is used by Node automatically. So here we're just using the library. All right, so now in my main, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a div with an ID of root. And the reason is that the way React works is you create this main element that's going to contain everything that React does. And typically you want to do it in either the body or in our case, we're doing it in the main within a div, and we give it an ID because when we tell React to update the DOM from the shadow DOM, we have to tell it which element in the DOM the shadow DOM should update. So in this case, we're giving it an ID of root, and what I want to then do is I am now going to create some JavaScript. I'm going to use my script tag, but I'm going to say that the script tag is going to use the type attribute, and I'm going to say it's text that's going to be interpreted by Babel. Right? This is the important part. What the Babel library is doing is it's saying it's looking for any script tag with a type of text to be interpreted as Babel or by Babel. Then any JSX that it finds inside of this script tag, it will go and create, it will actually transpile that into regular JavaScript. All right, so now with React, you have the concept of components, right? Components. The way a React application is built is you can think of a wireframe diagram that has different parts to it, and each part would be considered a component. And then you create a React component for that part, and you then tell it, build my page or build my JSX based on all of these components. It'll be a little difficult in this example because it's very simple, but when we look at a React example, when we use Node, the way most people write React, then it'll become a little clearer as to how components work. Now, in every React code, what we need to do is we need to obtain the root for the element. So here you can see we're defining a constant called root element, and we use the document.getElementID, and we pass the ID root, which is basically going to return this div here. And once we have that, and this is towards the end, all right, so I'm going to just put a couple of blank lines, we'll fill that in. But the last thing in a React app that you want to do is in this React DOM library, there is a React DOM class with a render function. And this render function is now saying, we want to render a JSX component called app, right? Now, we do have to go and define that app. So what we can do here is, if I can use a function, and the name of the function is going to match the name of my JSX component. And you can see here that this, all it does is inside of a div, it's going to return a component called a shopping list component. And we're going to say that the name of that shopping list is COP4111C. So you can kind of see how we are now using, because this here, this is JSX, line 27, that's JSX, JavaScript extended. Line 33 also includes some JSX. And what we can do is to create a component. This is kind of the new way, is to just use a function keyword in JavaScript. It's the new way to do it. But there is an old way of doing it, and I'm going to show you how to do it, just so that if you see the code, you can recognize it. And by the way, this is for both local, like we're doing here, or when you're using Node. Kind of works the same way. So here to use, so what we want to do is we want to create this shopping list component. And we can do that using the JavaScript class syntax. And you can see here that we are saying create a class called shopping list, which extends from React the component class from React. So we're basically extending React components. And we're saying that we want to render some information here. And you can see that, again, notice that each of these components returns something. And the returns part is what gets updated. One thing to bear in mind is that notice because this is JSX code here, right? This is all JSX code. Notice that you can have HTML embedded in JSX, but you can tell that it's JSX because in HTML, if you want to have a CSS class, you use the attribute class. However, as you can see on line number 23, class is a keyword in JavaScript, which means that you cannot use class in your JSX unless you're creating a JavaScript class. That's why when you want to reference a CSS class attribute in JSX, you have to use class name. And notice that the N is uppercase, right? JavaScript is a case-sensitive language. So if you were to make that lowercase, you'd get an error. All right, so basically what this is doing is it's saying I'm going to have a div with a class shopping list, and then I'm going to have an H1, and it's going to say list for this, and props. Props are properties, and it's saying the property name. And you can see here in my app, when I reference the shopping list component, I am passing it an attribute or a property. This is actually a property from a JSX perspective. So the props property will list all of those attributes that you might specify in JSX. And this is basically saying pull in the name property, which we provided here on line 42 as an attribute to my shopping list component. And that is pretty much it. So if I save this. And I go here. Hopefully, if everything works, I should see my shopping list. There we go. Right? I'm actually going to make this an H2. Because I already have an H1. So let's refresh that. But notice how it's saying shop content list for COP 411C, which was the property value that was passed as an attribute. And when you are writing or using React, it's common to do something like this. Now, let's just go and I do have this shopping list class. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have an embedded style with that shopping list class. And I'm just going to give it a border of 1 pixel solid black. Just to show you that when I refresh, you can see that if I have CSS and I want to incorporate CSS, I can do that. In fact, I'm going to add some padding to it as well, because it was a little close. So there we, oh, what happened there? Okay. For some other reason, it didn't like a refresh, but when I reloaded the page from scratch, you can see I now have a 5 pixel padding. Again, behind the scenes, these libraries that we're incorporating with the script tag is what we see for the it's taking the JSX and actually rendering it using JavaScript, and potentially in that JavaScript is some HTML that the browser knows how to handle, right? And the render function in React is what does all the work for you, right? And again, there are 2 ways that you can specify a component. The first is using a ES6 class, and the second is to just use a regular JavaScript function.